Nearly 2 billion of the world's population living in low and middle income countries still do not have access to basic medicines. This makes innovation so crucial in working to create sustainable local models of delivery. Partnerships between governments, civil society, pharmaceutical companies, and multilateral organizations are also key in ensuring people around the world can get access to medicines. My name is Sarah Jervine. I'm a global health reporter with Devex, and today we are joined by a series of experts to discuss strategies around tackling this problem. I first want to thank our partners in hosting this conversation, the American biopharmaceutical company Gilead. And now my colleague Amruta will start off our conversation speaking with a pharmacist who's on the front line of these efforts.
Hi everyone, I'm Amrita Bayatnal, back here again. And right now we have with us Farhan Yusuf, who's a pharmacist from Tanzania, who's joining us today to talk about, what pharmacists experience with regards to access to medicine and how he navigated this process throughout the pandemic. Hello, Farhan. It's nice to talk to you again.
Hello, Amrita. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Always a pleasure talking to and interacting with Devex and your team. Amazing job as always.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, if we could just dive in, we have about 10 minutes for this fireside chat, and I'd like to touch upon what your experience has been and also what you see, the challenges being going forward. So if you could talk a little bit about, as a pharmacist, how you dealt with this global scramble for medicines, throughout the pandemic. I know that here in India, there was quite a bit of a struggle, even getting basic medicines when we were experiencing the peak of the first wave and the second wave. So did you experience something similar, and how would you sort of describe that?
Thank you so much for that, Amrita. And I think, the challenges were not unique. I think COVID-19 is one of those scenarios that has sort of brought the whole world together, right? Different countries pretty much faced the same sort of scenarios, whether you are a developed country or a developing country. And so here as well, I mean, we had our regular shortage of PPEs. We had our shortage of other disposable items and other materials that could be used by health professionals in managing COVID-19, and of course the medicines as well. I think how we dealt with it, and I'll speak more from the private sector side. I think what was very interesting to see, firstly, I think what was interesting to see is that it broke down the silos between the public and the private sector. There was definitely a lot more integration and working together, which I hope continues even beyond the pandemic as well. So that was definitely something that was good. In Tanzania, we saw a lot of, because our government has been pushing for local production of medicines and other products for quite some time. COVID-19 provided that extra impetus to do that, and so we saw universities locally starting to manufacture things like sanitizers. We had people make their own masks and other disposable items as well. So there was definitely that innovation in terms of manufacturing that came up. And another interesting thing that we observed over here is that we had youth startups that also joined the movement as well and started creating 3D printing things like face shields. And so it was really how the private sector definitely came up with a lot of innovations and ideas to be able to deal with that challenge of supply, especially when it comes to these devices and supporting elements. As far as medicines is concerned, really, we do still face a challenge as far as local production is concerned. We did have to struggle in terms of getting the supplies, and just like any other country would have. But then the good thing was that, again, there was a certain robustness in the guidelines. Of course, with COVID-19, we've been learning, each and every day and been updating our guidelines. So again, I think that is a robustness that I hope continues beyond the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And that sort of allowed people or health practitioners to deal with shortages by complementing with other medicinal therapies.
Right. That's so interesting that you mentioned that, this was the time when the private sector and the public sector really worked well together. Do you think this is something that had been in the works for a while in Tanzania, especially because, there was also a sense of COVID denial in the country, for a long time. So did that contribute in any way, that, people outside were sort of feeling that they should kind of do something to help the cause?
Well, not really. I think as far as, private sector engagement goes, Amruta, there has been quite a lot of work that has been going on in Tanzania for quite some time. And yes, there are challenges. Of course, I think challenges around private sector engagement also, I tend to say, are not really unique. We see them in different countries. But as far as we are concerned, like I said, I think COVID-19 just provided that impetus because it was a situation that had to be dealt with. And, private sector generally tends to be more agile compared to the public sector. So whenever I think, and again, this is something we've seen in various other countries as well, the private sector sort of, coming up front with, new ways of doing things, with, innovations that help solve the situation. But I think for us, it has been, uh, coming a long time. These discussions have been going on for quite some time. Like I said, the push for local production has been there even before COVID-19. So this just further cemented, those objectives of the government.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that. And, so going forward, what are the kind of policies and interventions that you'd like to see that kind of keep the momentum going, as you were saying?
I think, just in line with what I said, Amrita, when I look at, supply chain, I think of it in two ways. And first is, getting the product or the medicines into the country. And just having medicines available at that level and just making sure that there's a supply. And there, I think one way of promoting that, again, I'm a very big supporter of local manufacturing and production as well. So I definitely think there's work to be done in creating more favorable policies, incentivizing people, the necessary skill building. I know right now there's a lot of those discussions, again, even about vaccine manufacturing, right? And we're talking about how, can we have the technology transferred? Can we have, waiver of the recipes to create those elements? So it's definitely a wave that I think we should continue riding, especially in Africa, in different countries. And that will really help solve that sort of high level availability challenge as far as supply chain are concerned. But then, the other side of supply chain is actually getting the medicines into the hand of the user or the client or the patient, so getting it to the last mile. And I think, policies that would be really helpful there, in my opinion, if I was to pick, one, since we are short of time, I would say that there should definitely be more favorable policies for youth and their startups. Because what we saw in Tanzania, for example, is that, in this time, we have seen youth startups that started doing, online sort of, ordering of medicines because people were afraid to go out and, to interact or to visit health facilities. There have been a lot of telehealth initiatives. There have been initiatives in terms of delivery of medicines to people's homes. So, and a lot of that has been done by young people. And, one challenge that I'm sure you've heard of quite a number of times is that youth startups, especially again in different African countries, don't usually get the necessary motivation or the support from policies. So I think that would really help now solve the challenge of, okay, so we have a national level supply. How do we get those medicines into the hands of the people?
Right. It makes so much sense, right, to say that, okay, these are our strengths and how do we use these for a new challenge that has been sort of thrown in front of us. Thank you so much for everything that you've said so far, Farhan. Just one last question. I know we're almost done. What lessons would you think that other countries need to learn from the Tanzania example?
I think the lesson that needs to be learned, Amruta, is, just this lesson of public-private engagement and the sectors really coming together and working hand in hand. Again, when it comes to the sustainable development goals, my favorite one is goal number 17 that talks about partnerships. And I really think that is a way forward for, not just countries in Africa, but for us globally as we face, these challenges such as COVID-19. Partnerships is definitely the way to go.
Right. Thank you so much. We will take that message forward and we will keep coming back to you for your comments, Farhan. Thanks for your time today, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you so much, Farhan, for those insights into how the private sector really pulled together and broke down silos during the pandemic in Tanzania. So now I am joined by a panel of experts who are going to walk us through some strategies on how we can increase access to medicine. So this includes Usman Khalid Wahid, who is CEO of Ferozan's Laboratories in Pakistan. Dr. Betty Cheng, who is Vice President of International Medical Affairs at Gilead, Dr. Homi Razavi, founder and managing director of the Center for Disease Analysis Foundation, a public health firm with expertise in epidemiology and disease modeling, and Dr. Carlos Passarelli, who is Senior Advisor to Access to Medicines at the Joint United Nations Programs on HIV and AIDS. Thank you all so much for joining us. So Dr. Cheng, to start us out, despite new medicines and treatments emerging from research and development pipelines, many people in low and middle income countries still lack access, even to some and many essential medicines. What are some of the systematic barriers facing them?
Thank you, Sarah. It's really a pleasure to be here on behalf of all my colleagues at Gilead. For Gilead, access to medicine is at the core of every employee, and we recognize this, which is why I was part of a group that was dedicated to making sure that people living in LMIC countries always had someone looking out at Gilead to find a way to access medicines. I work with a comprehensive team that actually does different roles to address the systematic barriers. My role was actually the medical education, building capacity, public health initiatives. So beyond the medicine, I always tell this to people that our innovative medicines are just pills in a bottle. They don't do anything. It's what happens when after the medicine comes into the country, how does the patient actually access that? So, getting the medicine into the country with regulatory issues is a challenge. And so we always believed in working in partnership with governments. We know that they needed to be involved. We had to work in partnership with all the community organization, other people working in the country, local community healthcare providers. So it was always with partnership in mind that you do this. We're one piece of the solution. So we have great examples of where we've worked in country having this type of model. In fact, I can think of our Georgia Elimination Project. When we took the factor of medicine out of the equation and we brought it into the country, that program was successful because we empowered people locally to be able to invest in the country, commit time and resources to doing all the things needed in order for patients to get access and get good treatment, and get followed and develop capacity. So it wasn't just the physicians, it was the infrastructure, the clinics, the diagnostics involved. And oftentimes it was also stigma and discrimination that issues that had to be addressed. So, barriers continue to exist. And I think Gilead, we continue to evolve and learn. We've had successful programs and we've actually had things where we could have done better. But what we knew was critical was that we have to embrace having monitoring and assessments where we can actually gauge our success in these programs and what have we done well and what do we have to kind of look at and say we need to do better about. So it's truly, I think, for Gilead, a partnership and evolving to the needs of what people. The world is changing. We need to embrace new initiatives, technology, and work with others to find solutions.
Thank you so much for that. Now moving on to Dr. Passarelli. So looking at the lessons that we can learn from efforts around access to HIV medicines, how can we use these lessons to be applied to ensure access to other types of medicines, and to how can we apply these lessons to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for the organizers for inviting UNH to be part of this important discussion. You know that UNH is participating in a lot of panels during the UNGA, the General Assembly, and because UNH is very concerned with the situation in relation what we call the colliding pandemics, HIV and COVID, because we see there is a huge impact of COVID in the HIV response globally. But in terms of lessons learned from the HIV response, I think that the first lesson that I would like to raise is community first. What we have in the AIDS response, that communities, they are put at the center of the response. And we have a new slogan that nothing about us without us. So we go to listen to people and to see their needs, to understand their needs, and to bring them to the decision, to the boards that decisions are made, because we need to translate this into actions. And it has an impact not only on prevention, which is quite obvious, but also on access to medicines, because you have a lot of community service models that have been implemented in complementarity to the official delivery models that is enhancing access to medicines for those that for some reasons access are being denied. Other factor is the mobilization of political will, which is translation and mobilization of financial resources, because political will without resources is empty. And we have seen in the AIDS response, not only from countries in the north, but countries in the south as well. And I think that the HIV has a little bit reshifted the paradigm donor and recipients. And for example, the Global Fund, we are putting people at the same table to decide the trends of the response and where resources are allocated. And for example, the establishment of UNITAID, which is basically, we have countries in the north, countries from the south deciding together how they can move the access to medicines agenda forward and creating solutions for that. The other aspect that I think that we can learn from the HIV response is to address the structural barriers for access to medicines. One of them is stigma and discrimination, and I think that Pat mentioned it very well. There are people that are being denied treatment and medicines because of who they are, because of who they love. And I think that we need to do some work in order to remove those barriers. You also have regulatory and trade barriers that are impacting access to medicines, especially when it comes at country level, in low and middle income countries. So we need to make an effort to to strengthen regulatory capacities in order to ensure the quality of the products that are entering into the national markets, but also strengthening capacities for producing drugs, medicines where they are needed. So I think it's something that we can elaborate a little bit later. And also the hurdles in the research and development cycle. I think that the issue of having products available in the north are not being exactly the same products that are being delivered in the south if they are delivered. So I think that we need to have public health drivers for research and development within the health sector, and not only the market drivers. And I think that sometimes we are being guided by market. Finally, we need to avoid complacency. AIDS is not over. We don't have a vaccine, we don't have the cure, and we still have a lot of work to do in terms for developing the technology that people need to have their healthier lives, and to end AIDS by 2030 as a public health threat. Thank you.
Just to follow up on one of those points, you mentioned political will, and that's something that we keep hearing a lot about with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that there's not enough political will. So do you have any thoughts on kind of ways that the HIV response had a more success at garnering that political will that's just not there with the COVID-19 response?
Well, we have in the COVID response a political will, political mobilization that has resulted in resources, for example, in the establishment of WHO, access to COVID tools, accelerator. We have the WHO COVID technology access pool as well that builds on experiences from the HIV response, like the medicines patent pool, which are mechanisms that most of them, they are voluntary, but we are not seeing companies and governments pushing very hard for making those technologies available for everyone, and to deploying those technologies in the South so that they can be produced there, or even have access to the products that are being developed in the North. So I think that's something that we can learn from the AIDS response, and to mobilize the political will, not only from governments, especially those governments that are investing on R&D, but also from pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, thank you. Now, Dr. Razavi, could you talk about how mathematical modeling can be used to develop intervention strategies, and how can these tactics be used by countries to develop plans around medicine access?
Absolutely. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. As you've seen, more and more groups are actually using a mathematical modeling for decision making, and this also applies to COVID-19. And the reason is, when we're really talking about public health, when we're talking about global access, there are a lot of variables to consider. Some of those are decisions we need to make. Some of those are uncertainties in terms of access, pricing. And then we also have to quantify what are our values. Are we really talking about a financial return on investment, or are we talking about reduction in liver-related deaths, actually, or morbidity? And so what models allows us to do is bring that all together into one place. A properly built model allows us to actually go through, pull all those variables together, and be able to assess different strategies very, very quickly. Because if we're looking at, for example, if you're doing clinical trials, it may take 3 to 5 years to run a clinical trials to actually see what the impact is, what the economic, and actually measure those. With a mathematical model, we can do that fairly quickly and then be able to assess. And it has been quite successful. We've seen it in a number of areas. In HIV, it's been used quite a bit. It's been used actually for viral hepatitis, and more recently for COVID-19 interventions that can reduce burden.
Thank you so much. And Usman, your company has just introduced Pakistan's first vaccine for hepatitis E. Can you talk a bit about what took the development of that vaccine some time, and the value of partnering with Shaman Innovax Biotech? Are these partnerships key to ensuring access in the global South to medicines, and how can this example be applied to the current pandemic?
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be part of this panel, and thank you for the great question. So hepatitis E is unfortunately almost exclusively a disease of the South. So countries like Pakistan are hyper-endemic in it, whereas in the North, it really doesn't exist because it's a waterborne virus, and in problems with sanitary systems. This is where the disease kind of plays out. So China was really the first country to study the virus and develop a vaccine. Xiamen is a city in China where the university actually studied it. And a biotech grew out of that effort, which was Xiamen and Devex biotech. And because it was hyperendemic in Pakistan, and it's a disease that for most people, for most healthy people, is not really that dangerous. But if you're a woman, and particularly sort of in your third trimester of pregnancy, it's lethal, 40% mortality in that stage. And Pakistan is a country that produces a lot of babies. So we have close to 5 million pregnancies a year, and a disease like hepatitis E poses a serious risk. But because it was largely a South problem, it really needed a South-South solution in terms of partnering. We approached Innovax. The vaccine is still in the stage of being considered by the WHO for full pre-qualification. So a lot of work needed to be done locally also to look at the medical evidence behind the vaccine, to get health policy makers to take a look at what the vaccine could provide in terms of strengthening the health system. And that took a long time. So in answer to your question, why did it take so long? Part of the reason was that because it's not a problem of the North, it doesn't get that attention from regulatory agencies, health policy bodies, etc. But here, once it went through those steps, and we recently, just a month before the pandemic, it got regulatory approval. So it's still in the process of being made available across the country, and hopefully, particularly in patients in pregnancy and in patients of chronic liver disease. These are the two most at-risk populations. It should make an impact. And when you talk about COVID, of course, that's a much, much larger problem. It's a global pandemic, right? And the scale of the solution that you need to answer something like that versus a disease that affects only specific countries, then you need a much bigger scale solution. And here, we're also active in COVID. We're one of the 9 licensee manufacturing partners for Gilead to produce remdesivir for 127 low and middle income countries. And I think the relevance of that manufacturing partnership is very high when you think of a challenge like COVID, is because between these 9 manufacturing partners, there's intense competition. So if you have a model where you voluntarily transfer your technology and are able to share it with multiple manufacturing partners who then compete with each other for different country needs, then you're ensuring a competitive landscape where affordability is automatically addressed through competition. And competition, I can assure you, is very intense in this space. But you're also ensuring very quick access, because these licensees are focused on the South. And between the 9 licensees, I mean, even in our case, we cover countries in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Africa, and also in Asia. So virtually almost all parts of the world. And so in vaccine, of course, you don't have vaccine producers with a model like this so far. The WHO is really pressed on the need for partnerships, licensing partnerships. And if you're able to develop a network of manufacturers, and given the scale of the pandemic, you need a much larger network than just 9 that was in the case of a therapeutic, then really that large network of manufacturers across the world that compete with each other to supply LMIC countries is really the need of the hour. One of the things I would like to add is that in addition to sharing that technology, it's important to ring fence it also through IP protection, not for protecting the IP necessarily, but to ensure that all the production meets a certain standard, that it's fully backed by technology transfer, vaccine or drug stability. It has the level of purity it needs, because when you're dealing with these emergency situations, the last thing you want to do is create another problem if there's a spurious vaccine or a drug created. So that's the one area where it needs, I think, a little bit of more strengthening in terms of a global solution like this.
Thank you very much. And now a question from our audience that I'm going to direct to Dr. Ching. How important is tailoring access models to local contexts? And can you share some examples from and good practices from Gilead's work?
So I think that in every country we work with, we always tailor to the local country capability and capacity. Uh, you know, we realized a few years back that most of our team members were not actually in the countries that we were responsible for. So a few years ago, we changed that model and opened up offices in country, right? So you sort of have to have this local person engaging with the community to find out what the needs were. And so I think that examples are, you know what you know from your own reference. I'm a physician. I came to Gilead after being a physician working in downtown New York. That's my reference of what I know. But by having people engage with people who are actually part of the healthcare system, you get to see the real challenges that they face and not take your own reference of how to manage things. So, Georgia project, I go back to that, or the Kenya PrEP project. The reason some of these were successful was because local people, along with global organizations, came together to do what would work, right? And so Kenya has one of the most successful programs to provide preventive services for people who need it. So I think that every program you do, if you work with the underlying system, your addition to the infrastructure, not a standalone. So I think that's really critical to be integrated with what already exists and works, and that what you're doing is not really swimming against upstream, but you're really adding to what capabilities. And I'm a strong believer of this because I think that if you see countries that we've worked on with HIV or with hepatitis, by building a capacity, right? So when we went to Georgia, we didn't try to reinvent things. We saw already what the HIV healthcare systems were. And so we added to that system, not trying to create a separate system because of what we knew. And then if you look at COVID-19, I think that countries that embrace that, it developed a capability that helped them address COVID-19 pandemic better because the infrastructure was there. And so we can leverage a lot of the existing things. We should be preparing for pandemics, not during a pandemic. That's a challenge, really helping to build capability is how we address, everyone deserves to have a strong healthcare system and capabilities.
And Dr. Passarelli, there's been a strong push during the COVID-19 pandemic for domestic production of medicines and vaccines. Can you talk about kind of how domestic production of antiretroviral treatment has helped improve access in low and middle income countries?
Yeah, I think that local production, and I would say more broadly generic production, was a key driver for putting prices down of medications used to treat people living with HIV in the global south. Everybody knows that new treatments were available by mid-90s in the north, but we took almost 10 years to have those treatments available in the south. And it was thanks to generic production and production in countries like Brazil, India, and others that were using policy options that could allow them to produce or to reproduce those medications in generic forms. And why those countries, they were successful in doing this? Because they, as I mentioned before, they could make use of flexibilities in the international trade agreements, like compulsory licensing and other parallel exportation and other flexibilities that they could use to produce the drugs that are needed everywhere. And also, as I mentioned in my previous intervention, the issue of voluntary license, I think it's important, and it's nice to have GILEAD in this panel because I think that GILEAD in the HIV area was one of the first companies that adhered to or joined the dependencies patent pool and provided their license, shared their license with producers in India. And that's why we say today that India is the country that is the pharmacy of the third world. producing with quality and good prices for everyone. But with COVID, we're not seeing the same type of response, unfortunately. As I mentioned before, we have the WHO COVID technology access pool, which is a voluntary mechanism built in the experience of the medicines patent pool, but companies, they are not willing to share their knowledge and technologies to produce vaccines, diagnostics and treatments and therapeutic options for COVID-19. So that's what I see, a missed opportunity, let's say this way, because we have a concrete platform or mechanism that has worked for HIV and could work for COVID as well, but companies and governments investing in R&D, they are not buying in. There is a discussion, very hot discussion in terms of the TRIPS waiver, how we can waive or temporarily waive intellectual property protections in order to allow production of COVID-related products, especially vaccines in the global south. There is a lot of reluctancy, to say this way, from some countries, especially wealth nations. Although you have the US pushing in this direction, which is nice, and would expect that other developed nations could follow the US in this regard. But we need to sit at the table and to discuss and to provide effective solutions. And we have a problem that we cannot waste time because we are seeing that the vaccine gap is widening, and what we call vaccine inequity. In the beginning, we were talking about equity, but now it's inequity. And we need to cope this. And I think that one way is companies to share voluntarily, and at the same time to think about a new system to reward innovation that's not dependent on intellectual property only.
And Dr. Razavi, did you have something to add?
Oh, so I'm the analytical guy, so I'm going to speak as from a numbers perspective. So when we talk about local manufacturing, I think it's incredibly important to be very clear what we're talking about. So I completely agree with need for voluntary licensing, absolutely, and I completely agree with the generic manufacturers being able to provide for low and middle income countries, whether they're in the North Hemisphere or Southern Hemisphere. I think there's a little bit of a confusion of local manufacturing, in the country, as was mentioned, Tanzania talk. And I personally fundamentally don't believe that's the right approach. And that goes back to Osman's comment earlier about quality and quality control. When we're talking about medicines and vaccines that go into humans, you need to have very, very strict rules and regulations in place to ensure quality. And small manufacturing will have fluctuations in quality. So we want to be concerned about that. It's much better to have a large manufacturer with systems in place to manufacture. Second is cost. As if you produce one car, if you build one car in your garage, it's going to cost a lot more than the Saab manufacturer in Sweden that's putting out 1,000 cars per month. It's the same thing with medicine. Right? There is a scale and there's a cost associated with that. It's much, much better to have generic manufacturers, multiple generic manufacturers to actually manufacture large scale, because that will bring down the cost. And that's what UNAIDS and the HIV program demonstrated, is the pool procurement, large manufacturing. What we saw in small manufacturing in countries is, in fact, the cost is always higher than what would be available through the international market. Fully agree with voluntary licensing. Generics, I would totally discourage about actually local manufacturing, because the cost will be higher and the quality is going to be variable that needs to be ensured. Thank you.
So just to bounce off on that. So on the African continent, there's discussion of creating these regional manufacturing hubs. So you would have South Africa, you would have Senegal, other spots across the continent. Would you be in favor of kind of these regional hubs that really kind of beef up their regulatory systems and pool resources?
Absolutely. If they can get the scale up, that's the point. I mean, the scale of antiretroviral that's being manufactured for the HIV programs are massive. So when you take that and you come to a regional, the manufacturing is going to be a fraction of what it is for a large manufacturer, and the price can never match. So if cost is an issue, which it always is, so unless we're going to have large donors essentially paying for the medicine and diagnostics, which is becoming less and less likely outside of HIV, TB, and malaria, then large manufacturers and getting the scale up is much more important. Again, that's purely numerical. It has nothing to do with the politics of the center. So of course, geopolitics will play an important role in this. But from a numbers perspective, the larger the scale and more competition, as Anshul mentioned, the better. But those competitors need to be large as well.
Okay, great. Did any of the other speakers want to? Osman, if you wanted to.
Yeah, sorry, just very quickly wanted to add. So when we talk about IP waivers versus voluntary licensing, the reason why voluntary licenses are so important, because you need to have, particularly for newer technologies, you have these great vaccines that have emerged in the shortest possible time in human history that are rolling out with really high rates of protection. Unless the manufacturing of those vaccines for the global South, whether it's in Senegal or South Africa or Egypt or Pakistan or India, unless it's backed up by technology transfer, by the innovators, by the companies that develop them, like Gilead has done with HIV or with COVID therapies, then you always run the risk of creating a new problem while trying to solve an existing one. So that's why licensing backed up by tech transfer is really important.
And Dr. Passarelli.
No, I would like to make the same point. I think the issue of local production is not dissociated of strengthening regulatory capacities. And if you look for the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa, that was developed for a long time, and they are still struggling to implement one of the key components at quality control, regulatory capacities. So we are not abdicating from quality when you're talking about strengthening local production capacities, because they go hand by hand. And indeed, I fully support the argument of economy of scale. When I was working in the Brazilian Ministry of Health and dealing with the procurement of drugs, it was much less expensive to buy drugs from India than producing locally. But I think that we need to make this assessment product by product. And I think that when you're talking about the mRNA hubs, I think the discussion is going to be completely different, because we're talking about a different technology. And I think that we cannot say that there is no economy of scale for COVID-19 vaccines today. So I think what is missing is the willingness of pharmaceutical companies to share the receipts with those that have the capacity with quality to produce those vaccines.
And Dr. Razavi.
I think one of the arguments for local manufacturing is uninterrupted supply chain. This is what countries are struggling with, and we saw quite a few examples during COVID where vaccines were being manufactured in India, and the government in India essentially said, no, we're not going to ship these out, we're going to use it locally. That is important. That is key. That is, and I completely understand where the countries and the regions are coming from. But that requires, if that's what we're talking about, that requires a different level of intervention, different types, to make sure that any country in the world can get uninterrupted access to medicines, vaccines, independent of the country's policies. And this has impacted China's policies toward manufacturing. Same concern that they do really promote internal manufacturing. Completely understand that. But improving supply chain is a different problem to solve than local manufacturing.
Okay, great. I wanted to bounce off that. Does anyone have thoughts on, so the African Medicines Agency has been ratified and is in the process of kind of coming into fruition. Does anyone have thoughts on how that could change quality control and regulation, harmonization and whatnot in countries across the African continent? Is anyone following that?
If I may, I think that the African Medicines Agency is an important step, as you are saying, in terms of, I was saying this before, strengthening regulatory capacities in Africa, because we have a long history in Africa in terms of the African Medicines Regulatory and Harmonization Initiative led by WHO and the World Bank in the past. It's still in place. And I think it started the discussion of the need to have continental agencies like we have the European one, like we have the FDA, like we have other regulatory agencies, stringent regulatory agencies. The pace of implementation is still slow. Personally, I would expect that we could go faster, but I think that we cannot go faster when not talking about quality. And I think that the stringent regulatory agencies like the FDA, EMA, and others in my own country, the National Regulatory Agency, they can support African efforts. And there is the WHO collaborative network of regulatory agencies. So I think that we need to make this more, to translate this in concrete results for the African continent. And I think that they are in the right direction.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I appreciate this dynamic back and forth. This has been really interesting. So I want to thank all of the panelists for their insights into what can be done to improve access to medicines. And to wrap it all off, I'd like to invite Dr. Harold Nusser, who is the head of Global Patient Solutions at Gilead. Dr. Nusser, I'd love to hear your reactions to the panel discussion. What points really resonated with you?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for this great panel discussion. It was fascinating to follow. And I will summarize some key points that stood out for me and integrate a little bit of spin of what I think to this as well. First of all, thank you very much for the active questioning from Mr. or Mrs. Abhishek. This is fantastic, spot on questions. I hope we had more time to address them all, but we can for sure follow up. Pandemics start and end at the community. So local ownership, localization was something which really stood out for me. When Carlos Passarelli said the political will, this is certainly coming from a local perspective, community first, clearly I heard this. I heard from Farhan, from the Fireside Chat, the agility and the innovation power when producing PPEs from small, medium enterprises, local organizations. Osman said the South-South vaccine development is key. And last but not least, Betty from my organization in Gilead said tailoring to the country was something that over the course of the time became clear that this is important. And through building offices and the stronger Gilead presence that helped to understand that IP and medicines is not everything, but that the patient pathway is critical, all from the beginning and to the follow-up, and several other panels during that session speak about the pathway of care. Of course, we also heard about stigma and prevention. Now, there is the production of medicines or vaccines is not everything, but it's certainly important. And we have seen this and just alluded to the importance of that. There is now an mRNA vaccine development with the support of the European Commission taking place in Rwanda, because there it seems the capabilities are in place. When I hear about global North, global South, I had asked myself one question. Is India, where most of our voluntary licensing partners come from, is India part of the South or of the North when it comes to disease burden, when it comes to production capabilities, capacities, when it comes to political will and behavior? Vaccines don't save lives. Vaccination programs do. So it's always important to have the end-to-end in mind. And this is something which can only happen from a community understanding, from a local understanding alongside national health plans. Beyond medicines, beyond making them available, beyond making them more affordable, the big question for me not only is also, do we reach enough patients? Yeah. Do we reach them across all the wealth strata in a given country? Or do we just scratch the top of the wealth pyramid? Do we reach them through a functioning health system via the public system? Are the treatments they are getting the appropriate treatments? Are they in good quality? And do we push them beneath the poverty line through the prices at the outlets? It's one thing to have a cheap medicine produced. It's another thing what it's actually costing towards the household. What is the private sector business model for prevention? This is something which that question was sparked through Homi's comment on when he said financial return and what I would translate into societal return on investment. What is the private sector business model for prevention? Not just the medicines, not just the vaccines, but is there a business case? Is there business that can be made around prevention as well? This for me would be a critical component, because then it's not only about making money and making sure that the intellectual property is available for more organizations so that more patients can be catered to, but also how can we prevent people from becoming patients? These are guiding questions for me, and I'd love to continue with those discussions in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was an excellent summary of our discussions. I'm wondering if you have any kind of closing thought to offer or any action item you want to kind of set forward with these UNGA events.
I would love to continue the conversation with more of the voluntary licensing partners, maybe in a similar event, in a stakeholder dialogue, maybe with even more people attending on the pros and cons, on the opportunities and also obstacles when it comes to the voluntary licensing model as such. Is it always the right model? Are there sometimes better innovations of business models that can also reach more people?
Okay, thank you. So we're sadly out of time, but please continue joining along for our other events. Immediately following is another UNGA ecosystem event produced in partnership with Smile Train. Thank you so much, Dr. Nusser, for joining us, and to all of our great speakers today. And thank you to our event partner, GILEAD, as well as our esteemed guests who have joined us today for this discussion. Take care.